Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Area Podcast. Hi, I'm Somia.
I'm Nana.
I'm Saya.
And I'm Josie.
Today we'll be talking about racism within the arts. Cue the intro!
The Area Podcast is brought to you by the Anti-Racism and Education Alliance. This discussion-based podcast aims to analyze subjects regarding racism and social justice. We encourage you to talk about similar topics to your friends, family, and surrounding community. Thank you for listening. Yay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Area Podcast. And as Saya mentioned, we are actually going to be talking about racism within the arts. All four of us are art students, so hopefully I think that we to some extent know what we're talking about. And we have a very interesting few points that we'd like to share, that we'd like to hear each other's opinions about. And as always, we encourage you guys to do the same at home. So let's start with classical art. Mana?
Okay, so classicism usually entails cleanness, simplicity, elegance, and a rigid art that follows the classical ancient Greece and Roman tradition and academics. So classical art is usually a term used to describe architecture or sculptures or pieces of art that are Eurocentric, and that term itself discriminates a lot of different artworks produced in different parts of the world and not just in Europe during this specific time, like the Renaissance and other periods of time that recreate that art from the Greco-Roman period. And basically there are three recreations or times of classical art. So the first one is classical antiquity, which is from the 4th to 5th BCE to the 4th century and 5th century BC. And the second one is classical revival, so a revival of the original classical art. And the third one is neoclassicism, which is from the 18th century to the 19th century. And that neoclassicism was included portraiture, history paintings, and there weren't a lot of paintings based on religion or love or the aristocracy, because it was mainly based on the values of the Greco-Roman period, where they had a democratic government. So that's why there weren't any paintings of religion or monarchy. And basically classical art overall is portrays a lot of white people, and yeah, so it basically does that shows that there's racism in art, and classical art is it's really, I don't know how to say this, but it's it's really praised by everyone. But yeah.
Hey, I think my first problem with classical art is its appraisal for being the quote unquote classic, when it's really just, it excludes so many other narratives that I know that we're going to explore later. But yeah, I think that's the first red flag when it comes to classical art, because it's deemed, definitely, like Mana said, in a higher class. But then a lot of the times what is higher class is equates to what is white or what is the history of white. So that's a very good point. Anybody else want to add?
I mean, yeah. Oh, go ahead.
And I feel like since it's studied universally in many schools or classes in general, the education curriculums are in itself reinforcing these attitudes, or emphasizing these values within the students, because we're learning them in a everyday setting.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think what bothers me the most is that when we're talking about like art movements and like historic art movements, all that is mentioned is European classical art. And it's not a bad thing. Of course, I want to learn about European classical art, but I abhor it when they
Yeah.
call it the classical art, because there was so much more art that we don't look at in our curriculum, and that bothers me a lot. Anyways, yes, Saya, I interrupted.
No, yeah, I totally agree. Like, Western art is just generally considered highbrow, and I guess anything else like foreign art is considered like exotic or underground, or even just in the arts, not just art, but like music and literature and all that. Everything classic is just it refers to the Western like Western arts.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's instilled in our brains and it's not talked about enough. So I didn't even recognize that that's how we were thinking until recently. And it just, I don't know, it's very shocking how, I guess, it's very shocking how I guess no one really understands that that's what we're doing when we talk about classic art, because that's not what we're taught.
Yeah. It's sad, but I think with a lot of the pressure that institutions are facing now, it's bound to have some sort of progress towards inclusion. I know, like in our club, we talked about how right now in our art class, I think annually we'll learn about one Black artist, and then we'll call it a day, and then everything else will be white artists. So hopefully it gets more inclusive, because I'm not here to only learn about what is considered sophisticated in by like classic standards, Western classic standards of art. There's a lot more to art that we're not seeing. There's a lot more to sophisticate, to the standard of sophistication that we're not seeing. And by establishing something as classical art, we're actually excluding a lot of it. So yeah, I agree with all of you guys. Okay, so let's move on to whitewashing. This borders on the artistic areas of film, as well as visual arts, photography, things like that. I think whitewashing, in the sense, generally represents any time a person or a portrayal is misrepresented as the person who is acting in this role, or whatever the instance may be, is white and they're not supposed to be. So the first thing I think of when I think of whitewashing is Breakfast at Tiffany's, because it was my favorite movie. And then I found out that the man who is Asian, like the friendly Japanese neighbor, was a white man the entire time.
Japanese.
And I was I was so convinced that it was this Japanese man. And I was like, look at Hollywood being so inclusive. And then I was looking at the credits and I was like, where's the Japanese name? I don't see it. And then I see it, and then I see the character's name, and it's like Mickey Rooney. And I'm like, who is Mickey Rooney? And I remember being so heartbroken, because like when I was younger, I was so obsessed with acting. And then I found out that it is borderline, like it was almost non-existent as a possible field of art for a lot of people of color, because there was so much like Black face and like Asian face and just general whitewashing, especially in film, because it was considered comedy. It was considered like the peak of its art form at one point, when you could play another race. And I think it's like beyond interesting, because you see that now a lot of people are demanding for the right representation, but then there's this whole fluidity in art that people kind of justify with like art with. So like, for example, with acting, it's like, are you only supposed to act what you firsthand experience? So only a war veteran can play a war veteran. And then people are like, but doesn't that play the same thing with race? Or like, can East Asians play South Asians, or can Chinese people play Japanese people? There's so many of these questions that float around in today's day and age, because of the fluidity in art. Like, can you bring the same thing to the table that other people who experienced it firsthand can? If you didn't, I mean. So definitely interesting. Another thing with whitewashing in art is voice acting. So
Oh,
with
yeah.
animated shows where there are like cultures that are real, that are like I'm losing track of my words, like East Asian cultures or African cultures, but when they're voiced by white actors, I have heard such a huge backlash from that, but I never really considered it as a disclusion. Maybe I think it's a harder conversation to have because that's very normal right now. Like I think I can name like 5 characters off the top of my head that are all played by white people, or like, you know, not their, who are playing not their race. And it's definitely an interesting conversation to have. So yeah, that's what we're here for today. So what do you guys think about voice actors playing roles that aren't made for them?
I think, okay, so I don't have that much experience with like listening to voice actors who aren't like quote unquote supposed not to be like that person.
Yeah.
Like they're representing someone else. And I feel like, but I still feel like if the right person isn't cast for a specific role, and like you said with the Breakfast at Tiffany's example, it's sort of like um it's sort of like taking control or taking like taking over the person's race or like person's narrative.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's wrong because then you're discriminating someone else, or like you're the reason why someone else is underrepresented.
Yeah.
And it
Yeah,
might,
yeah.
your portrayal of, I know it's just voice acting, but still the portrayal of that specific character's background, like nationality or race, ethnicity, is like, it may not be accurate because of the way that the voice actor is like saying something, or like their voice sounds different, so it doesn't completely accurately represent that person's race, for example.
Yeah, 100%. And it's
Yeah.
when someone whitewashes, you know, it's, I mean, it's first of all like derogatory, I guess, and also, it's this, voice acting is the same thing as acting, I think, because it's basically you're taking away the opportunity for another person of that, like, I don't know, of that culture or community, and you're taking that opportunity from them to, I guess, play their like whatever community that they're a part of, and it's already underrepresented, like Mana said, and so when you take that opportunity from them, then it just contributes to this whole like cycle of discrimination.
It's interesting that you say that because I think I agree with all your points, but then I also think that voice acting and acting are different, because I understand the argument where people are like, it's just a voice, like we're just using your voice, nothing more. But despite not visually maybe seeing the voice actor, I think that people kind of overemphasize on the spirit of the acting that is being done, to where they think that it is going to play such a dramatic role in their portrayal. But I completely agree with the underrepresentation of people of color, their roles and things like that, because that has been stolen from them before. So does this mean that people of color should be hired more for animated roles of their ethnicity? 100%, right? It's I think that it's justifiable in terms of like compensation, especially in the art fields. So yeah. Somia, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I have another example apart from voice acting. I think whitewashing can also be connected to the Western perception of like beauty. So for example, and I think her name was Andromeda. She was this princess from Ethiopia, from Greek mythology.
Yeah.
And while she was dark skinned, throughout Western art history, they have like always portrayed her as a white-skinned person, like light-skinned. They've never depicted her dark-skinned, and this is because for them, being dark-skinned and being beautiful were like two completely separate things.
Like they're mutually exclusive.
Yeah. So like this could also be seen in like Piero di Cosmi. I don't know how to say this.
You did great.
Piero di Cosmi. I'm gonna.
Do you want to spell it out for us?
Yeah.
Spell it out for our listeners.
Piero space di space Cosimo. Yes, that's the artist.
Yes.
But yeah, in his painting Perseus fleeing Andromeda, this can be shown because while her parents were depicted as dark-skinned, she herself was depicted as someone being very light-skinned, which I find why did that happen?
Yeah. Oh, and in like your example reminded me of it. But right now, there's a lot of Asian roles that are being played by half Asian, half white people, and a lot of full Asians in the industry. I've seen a lot of retaliation from them because it's like they shouldn't be playing a fully Asian role. But at the same time, I abhor that argument because as a half Japanese person myself, that makes it seem like you're telling me that I'm not Japanese enough. And that is a whole other argument that we'll get into on another podcast episode. That being said, we are going to move on to Orientalism. So Somya and Mana are going to introduce this for us.
Somya, you can start.
Yeah, thank you. So Orientalism is like the imitation of aspects in the Eastern world done by Western artists. And it could also be used to refer to the general patronizing Western attitudes toward Middle Eastern, Asian, and North American societies. This is because they essentialize these societies as undeveloped and like underdeveloped, as well as they often depict them to being very exotic and therefore racialized, and they insinuate a very sexualized culture, therefore fabricating like a view that can be exploited in the favor of like imperial power.
Yeah.
Mana, do you want to add anything?
Somebody said it all basically, but to add on a little bit of like explaining the terms, the opposite of that, like Orientalism, Orient is what the West used to refer to the East.
Yeah.
But the West would be referred to as Occident, and like that word means like standard or like centered, normal, fixed, and like so that's kind of like it ties in with the term like classicism or like classical art. It's that word Occident kind of like praises the West, and then the Orientalism kind of like discriminates the East and kind of sees it as like exotic and different. So yeah.
Well, what's interesting to note is that Orientalism may have been like 2 centuries ago, but the criticism of it was like in 1980 or in the 1980s or something, like 1970s. So okay, to me that's recent. To me 50 years is recent enough to the point where it's kind of shocking that there is a lot of discriminatory practices that I think have yet to be acknowledged, and we're just not aware of it. But also a lot of people criticize this hypersensitivity. You know, those people that are like, we can't joke about anything these days. You're correct, you can't, because we're trying to like pursue the betterment of society. So yeah, I think in terms of acknowledging Orientalism, it's very important because it's this fetishization of ethnicities, this generalization, this when people romanticize an entire countries, I think it's abhorrent. I also think it's very offensive because you're kind of diminishing a vast ocean of identities into this one melange of one. So yeah.
And especially since many Orientalist artists use naturalism or like a very realistic style, their paintings portray the viewers of the painting thinks that whatever they're painting is happening in reality. So like in like everyday settings of these countries, but this is very misleading because it is often like staged or like just in general they're just painting the wrong things. But like people when viewing these paintings they get influenced in like their view of how or like they get influenced in their perspective of these countries.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's interesting that you say that. Like the fact that the Western perspective of the East became so dominant and such like a cultural capital that got transferred throughout Europe is, I don't want to say that it was expected, but also I could see how easily that happened just because there was already this domination. So yeah, very interesting few points made. In terms of time, we should move on to our next topic. So graffiti and modern art. This actually ties back into our first topic of classical art, what we consider to be classical art, classical music. They're all sort of in this they all have connotations, of high class activities. The orchestra, this obviously comes from Europe, but also it's considered to be a high class activity, a practice. Also like a lot of things that have cultural depth come from these higher classes, higher societies. And these are supposed to be considered such like a sophisticated form of art. But when you look at modern art, when you look at graffiti, slam poetry, rap, all of these aren't considered high status. They are relatively new compared to the others, but at the same time, you will see a domination of race, same that you will with classical art. So this being said, classical art, of course, is mostly dominated by white people, Europeans. But with modern art, graffiti, modern music, it's a lot of it was revolutionized by African Americans, as well as just people of color further down south. So I think this, we can mostly see this in context in the States. We see the proliferation of rap styles, of those beat-orientated music, especially in poorer neighborhoods. So this also has, of course, geographic context. So yeah, it's a separation of the arts, and I think that when people connote race to it, because they are such very heavy race orientated forms of art, but when they focus on it, the fact that you already think of a race when you do that already shows that you have to be mindful when it comes to organizing these forms of art. Okay, so personally, I think I've already spoken about a lot about how I feel about this. I think that it's produced from a lot of historical narratives, but like the consequences of our history, but because there hasn't been a lot of acknowledgement, maybe we already see economically being supported into one specific group of art that is much more celebrated by a specific group of people rather than this lowbrow form of art. So yeah, I think it's definitely a form of discussion. A lot of people actually argue to separate art from the artist, and then from this notion they started to separate art and race. So for example, what's it called, like cultural appropriation. A lot of people, I know, like in late 2010s, people became really like honed in on cultural appropriation of music. So when Bruno Mars, like he wasn't African American, and people were like, why is he singing so African American? And then to me, I don't really understand that. Maybe you guys have stronger sentiments of that, but yeah, what are your guys' thoughts?
Wait, can you elaborate more on the Bruno Mars thing?
Oh,
I
yeah.
actually didn't know about it. Yeah.
Like, okay, so Bruno Mars is, I want to say Latino. He's Hispanic. He's something that is an African American, but people thought that his style was very heavy on R&B, very, very black, so to say, very influenced by black music. And people, I don't understand why people got so aggravated over that, because I'm not saying that like he's the leader of black music, like this whole pioneer of it, but to me, I never really thought that it was a problem when people started experimenting in fields of art that weren't necessarily from their culture, because essentially that's what we're doing in art class. Like I'm learning about impasto technique and shadows and highlights. This is all like Western art. My African ancestors didn't do this. So yeah, it's the same thing to me. But
yeah, definitely. Yeah. I think it's, yeah, I agree with what you said, that you can experiment and not have it be cultural appropriation. Yeah, and I lost my train of thought. What were you talking
Wait, can I
about?
add on to Saya? I think I kind of know what you're trying to say, maybe. I feel like you were trying to say, yeah, I feel like you were trying to say, like cultural appropriation now, especially, is kind of a problem, and like with increased like social media and celebrities and stuff, but like there's a difference between cultural appropriation and appreciation, or like inspiration. And in your case, like Josie, you said that like you didn't see that much of a problem with Bruno Mars experimenting with music, and like, I mean, it's not just him, right? Like a lot of people,
yeah,
a lot of people
so
in the
many
music industry are,
rappers.
yeah, I mean, art basically is about like being inspired by things and other artists, and then you trying to portray your own like interpretation of something, like a theme, in your way, or it might be inspired by another person, and that can be in like art, like painting, or it can be music, and can be in like film, anything like that. But like we're all inspired by other cultures maybe, so it's not necessarily like cultural appropriation every time someone does that, but I think it's like a spectrum. Like you have to be careful with how you portray your inspiration.
Yeah, I think really accurate. Especially because art is such, it's basically a field of creation. It's a field of creativity. And when you limit it in terms of your history or whatnot, I think it's already limiting to the fact that it's supposed to be a creation of art. I know that we could go into a whole other field of what is and isn't allowed in art, morally speaking. But again, that's a whole other conversation that maybe we'll have in another day. So in the interest of time, we're quickly going to move on to institutionalized art. So in preparation for this podcast, I looked a lot at the Art newspaper, which is an online newspaper that you can look at. And they have a whole entire section dedicated to racism within the arts. And to me, I think that you can read all about how art has been racist, but I think that's important for awareness. But what I think we should do is actually look at real life instances. So for example, there are a lot of museums in the US and the UK that are getting targeted just because maybe their collection of art weren't inclusive enough, or presented maybe a lot about slavery and maybe not anything that was necessarily pro-Black or pro-Indigenous, pro-BIPOC. So yeah, I know a few curation directors of such museums had to actually resign because of how much they're getting targeted and things like that. So we do see progress as aggressive as this was. This was late last year, by the way. I think that we do see a lot of progress, a lot of pressure that is felt by the art industry, because the circulation of art, I think, used to follow in this high status circle, but now that it's bleeding into the lower classes, the pressure on the people who are in charge of curating art, of showcasing art, is increasing tremendously. So yeah, yeah, go ahead.
Can I add something? I'm not sure if this is related to this topic, but like many art institutes, like I read that they often talk about surrealism.
Yeah.
Surrealism in the context of World War I and World War II, but they purposefully omit the surreal, like the ideology or like the anti-colonialist response that a lot of these surreal artists adhere to.
Yeah.
So like they like purposefully like omit certain parts of like our history, which is like promotes this
problematic.
Problematic and racist mindset.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say that like we often forget that, I guess, these white-led art institutions, they they exclude these or misrepresent the voices of Black or people of color or indigenous artists' voices, and also that if you think about it, like the patrons of art, the museum board members or the collectors or the audiences even, art for high culture that we were talking about earlier, and even people who just make I guess like the fundamental policies within these institutions, they're well, I'm speaking mainly in America, but they're mostly white, and I guess that there's an intersectionality of like that ethics of wealth and these issues of race, but we often forget to talk about that, and it's not noticed enough.
Yeah, I think okay, so I had a similar conversation with a friend earlier, but they were basically saying that like in Japanese art, you only see Japanese people. So they were like, why is it wrong that we only see white people in white art? And the main issue with that is Black people had such a huge impact on the history of white people, and white people benefited from the enslavement of Black people for like 3 centuries. And if that didn't happen, I'm sure I would not necessarily be so aggravated by praising white art constantly. But because it did, and because you see more Black people painted as slaves, if they're even painted at all, there's a whole like you see the contrast of the two. Like in Japan, we're an island. Like most of us are just Japanese. As you like, because we're an island, we're not going to have a lot more like diversity.
Yeah.
So you can't compare the two because Europe colonized like half of the world. And so yeah, I see a lot of issues regarding when you compare the celebration of white art and Japanese art, for example. Okay, so we're actually 100%. We're actually over the time limit. So thank you everybody for talking. Quickly to summarize, I think we have been very critical about classic art and white art. And just to say, we all do love the classic movements of art. I think that we all find them really interesting. We all find them beautiful. We just also want to be taught more. As a school, as people, as individuals, we can always be doing more to learn, and we can always be doing more to be more inclusive. That being said, thank you for listening to this episode of Area. As always, we encourage you to do your own research. Area episodes are all discussion-based and opinion-based, so none of these are necessarily facts of the universe. So yeah, we hope you enjoyed, and thank you for listening. Bye. Say bye. Bye.
Bye.